Chernobyl was released in 2019, and from the moment that it landed on our screens, it was a show that had everybody hooked after the first episode aired. So much so that it rose to the top part of the IMDb charts and is considered one of the best TV series ever made. Sitting behind Breaking Bad and Band of Brothers, something which shows the quality of the show we're about to spend 5 videos delving into. Whilst this show isn't new, I love covering older shows, and seeing as though I covered every episode of Band of Brothers, I thought it was now time to delve into the show that's one placement below it, Chernobyl. So let's delve into the episode and break down all that there was to take away from it. Here is a breakdown of Chernobyl Episode 1. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. So this episode started out at the latest point that we saw this show set in, April 26, 1988, and it was long after the explosion at Chernobyl took place and the means of covering it up, playing down its severity and the rectification of the issue was handled. We were in Legasov's apartment as he was recording a message on a tape in which he snuck out of the house to hide, and as he did so, we saw that he was being watched. This immediately set up the environment to be one that was dark, ominous, and full of uncertainty. There was a line that Legasov said that pretty much summed up the entirety of the series, and you don't realize how important it is until the series came to a close. He said, "The danger of lies is if we hear enough, then we no longer recognize the truth at all." This was something that not only connected to the way that Chernobyl was handled, but also the lack of intelligence and uncertainty and just pure blagging that took place in the immediate aftermath following the explosion. Something which went on to cost thousands of lives. Legasov is the human in this show. He is us in the show, and it was clear to see that from the off. During his speech as well, we heard him mention that Dyatlov was to blame and that he only got 10 years in jail for criminal mismanagement. Obviously, at this point, these are just names, but when the episode went back in time to the night of the explosion, we saw exactly why he felt as though Dyatlov was to blame for the management of what occurred. The final line in his speech that stuck out to me was when he said, "A just world is a sane world. There was nothing sane about Chernobyl." I'd obviously known about the Chernobyl disaster before going into the show, but I didn't truly know in detail how the night played out, how it was handled, and the way things were played down. So Legasov's recording really did set the scene for what it was that we were later going on to be seeing in the episode. The section concluded with Legasov ending things for himself 2 years and 1 minute after the Chernobyl explosion happened. Something which felt symbolic of the fact that it dominated the small part of his life in which he was immersed within it. But that's something we'll later go on to find out about. During the scene where he arrived back in his apartment after getting rid of the recording, and just before he ended things, there was this sound in the background which felt like it was almost mimicking an alarm. The alarm that we'd later go on to spend a large part of the episode listening to. It provided tension and almost showed us that Legasov's time was up. This was a great opening section to the episode. Not only did it serve its purpose in laying down the foundations of the tone and mood that the show wanted to set, but it showed us the impact of the after effects of what occurred even 2 years later, and it was extremely thought-provoking. Because how did this man end up in a position where his only way out was for him to end things? 2 years and 1 minute earlier. This part of the episode was something which I thought was also handled really well. It was the dead of night in Pripyat, and we were witnessing Ludmilla walking around her house as she woke up during the night. Here we established 2 main things. She loved her husband because of the way that she was looking at him whilst he was sleeping. And also, she was pregnant. 2 things which later impact the story. It was during the silence that we were almost like a fly on the wall, and we saw the explosion happen far away in the distance, but it took several seconds for the sound of it and the impact of it to reach her apartment. She wasn't even watching it as it happened, because why would she? But we were. This really lent into the whole, what you don't see is far more impactful. Granted, we did see the explosion, but we didn't see it close up. So what this did show us already was the reach that it was going to have, and that this wasn't just any type of explosion. I also thought the fact that one of the lights being switched on in the apartment block opposite was a nice touch, as it showed that other people also felt what happened, and there would be this sense of not truly knowing what was going on and the twitching of curtains. From there, we then went to the power plant, and the opening shot of the camera just slowly moving around Dyatlov was a way of really showing that within his mind, he knew that he'd messed up. The close-up shot and the fact that people were calling him and he wasn't responding showed that he was just stuck in his own world, and it also showed how in denial he was from that moment on. This was a common theme for Dyatlov, not accepting what had happened in front of him and just being in pure denial. It was said that the core had exploded, but Dyatlov didn't believe that it was possible for that to happen. With him being told, "I don't think there's a core," and him responding with, "You're mistaken," it showed that he wasn't prepared to listen. However, there was a sense of something that was going through his mind when he was on his own and walking through the corridor, as he looked concerned over what had happened. The shot of the block that was glowing orange showed the first signs of just how severe this was going to be. The denial that Dyatlov had was something which was then passed on to the fire brigade, as they were naive as well as to what was happening, because they hadn't been told just how severe the situation was. For example, they were making mistakes from the off and getting too close to it, even going onto the roof when they should have been nowhere near it at all. That was the beginning of the ripple effect, which then meant that people outside of the plant were going to be impacted. 1:25 a.m. During this part, the use of sound was something which was pivotal. We went from hearing the radio dispatch operators, which lured us in with the panicked state. We then had complete silence as Lyudmila and Vasily were talking with one another, and then it was the polar opposite, where the alarm was going off and it was at the forefront more than the visuals were. This was where the search for the dosimeter began, to truly see just how dangerous the environment was that they were all working in. With Chernobyl being a large place, it meant that nobody truly knew what was going on. People knew different levels of information about what had happened, and this was shown best when somebody believed that they'd been bombed and that the explosion wasn't caused internally. The lack of understanding of what happened and how to respond was a key theme of this first episode, and it was actually the very thing that meant that it went on to be as damaging as what it was. With Valera searching for the dosimeter, seeing how his face had changed in the short amount of time that he was there, it was the first sign of the fast impacting effects that it could have on the people in the environment. The scene where he was then walking up the stairs and through the corridor, the close-up handheld movement paired with the dark lighting and the sound of the alarm really gave the illusion of feeling trapped and like there was no way out of the danger and chaos that was ensuing. The first time we saw a sight of the explosion, we saw Victor, who looked like he was on the cusp of death. But as well as that, the environment was almost like it was something from Stranger Things and the Upside Down. It was sci-fi-like, ash flying everywhere and radiation being the most prominent thing in the air. The moment that summed up Dyatlov's ignorance and naivety to the situation was the fact that the reading on the dosimeter was showing 3.6. He said, "Not great, but not terrible." This was something which Legasov would show conflict with in his phone call at the end of the episode, where he was actually concerned over that reading. When in reality, as we know, 3.6 was the limit on that device and it was far higher than what it was reading. There was a sense of panic amongst the workers there, but Akimov said that they did everything right. And by that, I feel he meant just simply following the orders. We saw how explosive Dyatlov could be, and even when there was resistance, he would simply make people do it if they didn't want to. 1:30 a.m. This was when the fire brigade first arrived on the scene, and we saw that they really didn't understand what was going on because they hadn't been told just how severe it was. Vasily was there and he told Misha to put down one of the blocks that was radiating, something which eventually went on to destroy his hands even with gloves on. The line, "Can you taste metal?" was something which was apparent throughout many different characters in this episode in many different environments. So it showed the rapid spread that was happening. The taste of metal can be a symptom of radiation poisoning at a high dose, hence why it was featured a lot in this episode. Back in the residential area, we saw that the citizens didn't understand the severity of what was going on either, as one of them said, "We're going to get a better view," and Lyudmila responded by saying, "It could be dangerous." It was clear to see that she was worried about Vasily, but she was told, "He's never got hurt before, he'll be fine," something which was dramatic irony at its finest. Within the plant, Dyatlov thought it would be appropriate to get more hands on deck and called in the day shift, something which eventually went on to cause the claiming of more lives from the disaster. At this point, Dyatlov had become unhinged and he was threatening Akimov and essentially saying that he was going to pin it on him if he didn't do what he said. During this time period as well, at the hospital, we saw that it was a quiet night, and one of the nurses said, "Do we have iodine pills?" And it was met with a response where the person said, "Why would we have those pills?" Iodine pills essentially help a part of the body stop radioactivity from being absorbed, hence why this was such an important line in the episode, because they didn't have any. At the end of the episode, we obviously saw that the hospital was in complete contrast to how it was during the beginning, as it became overrun and extremely busy. 2:30 a.m. Within this section, this was where we were introduced to two other incompetent individuals, Femina and Brukhanov. They had the same mindset as Dyatlov, where they didn't view 3.6 as being too bad on the dosimeter. They even said a similar line to him, "Not great, but not horrifying," showing just how similar they were. However, this was where doubt was put in our mind as the audience because we heard that the good meter wasn't being used, so it was going to be far more dangerous of a reading than what they'd been seeing. With many civilians now standing on the bridge, the line, "It's beautiful," was spoken by somebody, and that's actually probably one of the most haunting things in the entirety of the episode. As this was said, there were particles and ash that were moving through the air, and it showed everybody that was present there, mothers, fathers, and children, showing that nobody was going to be shown grace at the hands of the radiation that they were absorbing. This wasn't beautiful, it was deadly, and death was going to be arriving to them all. A scene that pretty much summed up the mood that everybody should have been feeling, and something which showed a sense of the gravity of the situation, was when somebody was asked if they needed help, and they simply responded by saying, "It's over." This, paired with the water that was now entering the plant, contrasted with the radiating glow of the flame, was something which felt like there was an ounce of relief and comfort there, when in reality there was none whatsoever. There was nothing anybody could truly do about the situation at that moment. They were all being harmed by just being there. Vasily's face being red compared to how it was when he first got there showed that he was feeling the effect of the radiation, and with them being told that they were going to be going to the roof, it showed us that it was only going to get worse. The saddest part of this scene was that you could tell that he questioned going to the roof, because there was a moment where we saw inside of his mind and he was thinking of his wife, but he still moved on. 3:30 a.m. This section was a really interesting moment, and it was far different to the others because we saw the control room without Dyatlov in, and we got to see exactly what the workers were truly thinking without the authoritative figure of Dyatlov intervening in conversation. If it's true, then we're dead. 1 million people are dead. This was the first time we were actually explicitly told just how severe the situation could actually be. 1 million people being killed is a ramification that's beyond anybody's wildest imagination. So Dyatlov's negligence and not even considering what could be happening and being narrow-minded showed that this mindset was something which was extremely dangerous. 5:20 a.m. At this point in the episode and in the timeline, it was where it essentially reached the point of no return, and the damage that was going to be caused not only to people's lives, but the city, the plant, and the long-lasting effect that it would have were planted in cement. The accident is well under control. This was the first major lie that was uttered in the room. This wasn't the case at all, as we knew, and there was simply chaos everywhere. People were dying all around the plant, but the information wasn't reaching them. There was one person in that room who was intelligent enough to understand the severity of what was going on, but he was undermined constantly. The mass outnumbered the few, and his voice was eventually lost, as he felt as though the town should have been evacuated, and he even stated that the air was glowing. With between 2,000 and 4,000 police officers being called into the city, the decision was made to seal off the city and not allow anybody to leave, whilst also cutting the phone lines to stop the spread of misinformation. The promise of being rewarded for the way that they acted on that night was mentioned, but that was the last thing that was ever going to happen. When Akimov finally got a hold of the good meter, he said that with its 1,000 capacity limit, it burned out, which showed that the radiation levels were extremely high. At this point, Dyatlov was still in denial, as he simply responded by saying, "What game are you playing?" Showing again that he wasn't educated or trained well enough to be able to deal with the situation that was at hand and was unfolding. In a situation where every minute mattered, hence the structuring of the episode and the minutes being important, he wasn't taking it seriously enough. So much so that he eventually passed out himself and needed to be taken outside. This is where he saw the chaos and devastation for the first time through his own eyes. And I think at that point he realized that he messed up and had mishandled the situation completely. Akimov was then forced to go to the roof overlooking Block 4, which is where the explosion occurred, and with him simply looking over and then just looking back, his face was unrecognizable as he was extremely red and the black smoke was just billowing in the background. A sight that has stuck with me since first watching the episode. 7:01. The final section of this episode was focused on the phone call that Legasov, the person who we met at the start of the episode, had with Boris. This is where everything that we saw in the episode and the lack of understanding of not only what was going on, but the severity of the issue was brought to the forefront. For example, Boris said, "The system control tank exploded," to which Legasov responded and said, "The control system tank." This was a small correction, but in these life and death situations, the smallest of details matter, and it showed that information was being passed along incorrectly. We also saw Legasov say that 3.6 was actually a significant reading and it should be something to be concerned about, when in reality, as we found out, it was actually already above 1,000 at that point. These final few minutes of that phone call contradicted everything that we saw the professionals in the power plant saying and doing, something which made the environment and the gravity of the situation feel even more dangerous. The shot of the smoke travelling highlighted that it was spreading and it was going to be far-reaching. With the block of flats in the distance and the bird on the floor dying, that was almost like the first innocent life that was claimed that wasn't directly involved in the power plant. If the bird was going to die, then what did that mean for the people of Pripyat? What was on the horizon? Smoke and radiation that was going to bring death and devastation. My review of the episode. This was genuinely one of the best opening episodes to a TV series that I've seen. The pacing of it was so well handled, and the focus on the exact minutes of the evening that the explosion took place was something that not only worked from a creative perspective, but it also allowed us to understand the importance of every minute during the chaos that was unfolding. Paul Ritter delivered a phenomenal performance as Dyatlov during this episode, and the denial and naivety that he had, which was driven by fear when you could tell that he knew that things were far worse than what they were when he was on his own, was performed so well. The environment being the enemy in this unforgiving, hostile place, which was quite literally transforming anybody that was in its proximity and was prepared to get close to, was so frightening and haunting. The dark cloud that loomed above at the end was genuinely like death approaching the people, and it was a harrowing way for the episode to finish. The use of sound in this episode was something that not only made it feel immersive, but it contributed to the panic that should have been occurring in front of our eyes. I like the way that the single phone call at the end of the episode unraveled everything that we saw unfolding before it, and the highlighting of how not prepared and educated the people in control of such power had. The visuals were also exceptional, and they were haunting to look at. Seeing the damage that was being done to the people and the fast, unforgiving nature of it was horrifying. And with this only being episode 1, far more worse was to come. I plan on covering the entirety of this limited series, so if you enjoyed this video then hit subscribe and be sure not to miss the next breakdown that I post. So, there you have it, a breakdown of Chernobyl episode 1. Be sure to come back in a few days where the second episode of Chernobyl will be getting the same treatment as this. What did you think of the first episode? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As always, thanks for tuning into the video and I'll see you in the next one.